I'm Jessica, the Museum Guide, and today I'm here at one of the most famous cemeteries in the world, Père Lachaise in Paris. Here we are at Père Lachaise. Now this is one of the most visited cemeteries in the world, and it's one of Paris's leading tourist attractions. We're going to stroll around today and learn all about the contemporary cemetery, visit dozens of its most famous inhabitants, including Jim Morrison, Oscar Wilde, Edith Piaf, Sarah Bernhardt, and many, many more, and learn about the putrid reasons why it was established in the first place. At 110 acres, or 44 hectares, this eerily beautiful place is home to more than 1 million bodies, and many, many more in the Columbarium, which holds the remains of the cremated. We'll visit that later on. Now, of course, I'm the museum guide, and I love just how many connections there are in this cemetery to the different museums that we visited together and that we'll visit in the future. Painters, sculptors, writers, and even curators. As much as we are going to focus on the beauty and peace of the cemetery today, this is as much an art and history tour as it is a cemetery tour, because the sheer number of important artists that are buried here. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I'm delighted to have you here. And if you're returning and you're interested in getting even more content, I'll pop a link just above to my Patreon channel. I post one extra video tour for my patrons every single month, plus a lot of other bonus content, so I'd love to see you over there. I am planning to release a version of this tour as a guidebook that you can purchase in the future. Let me know in the comments below if you'd be interested, and when it's available, I'll pop the link above. But let's get back to the matter at hand and visit our first grave, one of the cemetery's most visited. That of Edith Piaf, nicknamed La Môme Piaf, or the Sparrow Kid, known for her impassioned interpretations of French ballads. After all, she was a native Parisian, actually from this area that we're in right now. She was born in 1915 and brought up in Belleville, abandoned by her singer and circus performer mother, and was raised for some time in a brothel run by her grandmother. She was blind for a time as a child and then sang on the streets to earn a pittance to support herself and her circus performer father. She rose through the ranks at music halls and soon became the darling of France and beyond. I just love this picture of her, but despite this carefree expression, Edith was plagued by health problems and alcoholism throughout her life, tortured by demons and addiction. She died in 1963 of liver failure at her villa on the French Riviera, and her husband Theo secretly drove her body back to Paris so fans would think she had died in her hometown. Her funeral procession drew thousands, and it was the only time since the end of World War II that traffic in Paris had come to a complete stop. She's buried here with her father, Louis-Alphonse Gatien, as well as her daughter, Marcel, who died at the age of 2 when Piaf was just 19, as well as her second husband, Theo Sarapo. And just a few steps away, a grave that receives far fewer visitors, but is known to any art lover. This is the shared grave of Italian painter Amedeo Modigliani and his common-law wife, Jeanne Hébuterne, a story, like so many others here, steeped in tragedy, romance, and addiction. Modigliani was an Italian artist of Jewish origin who arrived in the French capital in 1906, painting and sculpting in the vibrant environment of the École de Paris. He is known for his modernist portraits and nudes characterized by a surreal elongation of faces and necks. His work was not well received during his lifetime, but became highly sought after his death. Now he's buried here with his frequent sitter and common-law wife, Jeanne. You can see her here. She was known for her long, dark hair and haunting beauty. As a teen, she modeled for the Starving Artist set, including Suguharu Fujita. She too loved to draw and studied at the Accademia Colorossi. It was here in the spring of 1917 that she was introduced to Amedeo Modigliani. And come on, he was really handsome. Despite her parents' strong objections, they soon moved in together. Though she loved him deeply, life with the mad, moody Modigliani was hard. He had serious substance abuse issues, not to mention steadily worsening tuberculosis that he was hiding from his friends. Remember, TB was the leading cause of death in France by 1900, and it had no cure, so it caused sufferers to be ostracized. When Jeanne was just 20, they moved to Nice, and she gave birth to their daughter. And by that spring, they returned to Paris, and she became pregnant again. In 1920, Modigliani eventually succumbed to his tuberculosis after a long battle with drugs and alcohol. His poor health contributed to his susceptibility to the disease. Hébuterne's family brought her back to the family home that evening, but she was in a deep state of grief and she couldn't bear to go on. She threw herself out of the 5th-floor apartment window, dying by suicide. Her family blamed her demise on Modigliani and initially interred her in the Cemetery de Bagneux. Nearly 10 years later, though, the family finally relented and allowed her remains to be transferred to Père Lachaise to rest beside her love Modigliani. Their 14-month-old daughter, who later became an art historian, lived a long life. Her epitaph reads, "Devoted companion to the extreme sacrifice." I mean, tell me about it. Wow. I've been wanting to gain some new video editing skills for a while now. I mean, I have the history stuff down, but when it comes to the techie skills, mine leave a lot to be desired. That's why I just joined Skillshare and I took the Mastering iMovie class. And now I'm wondering why I waited so long to join. Skillshare offers thousands of creative classes in tons of different categories. Best of all, you can go from a casual beginner to a pro in just a few hours, and then get ready to tackle your next new skill. I'm just so impressed with all of the options that are available on Skillshare. From photography and graphic design to marketing and business, even cooking. I'm excited to start taking some writing classes to get my creative juices flowing. In 2025, I'm trying to take as much time to nurture my creative side as I do my health and wellness. Skillshare is just one part of this journey, and it's already made such a huge difference in my life. Are you ready to start learning some new skills? The first 500 people to click the link in my description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today. It's a new year. There's never been a better time. Now, back to Père Lachaise. I never get over how lucky I am that you guys allow me to do this for a job, or at least most of my job. Now, are you even a weird, bookish, gothy girl if you don't have a Parisian belly pock obsession? So here we have the grave of the wild, eccentric, bisexual Jane Avril. You could see here her married name, Jeanne. She was one of the characters made famous by the louche alcoholic dwarf Toulouse-Lautrec, who used to haunt the bars and dance halls of Montmartre to gain inspiration for his paintings and drawings, and to drink. Mostly to drink. She was famously portrayed by Zsa Zsa Gabor in the 1950 Moulin Rouge, and then served as the main inspiration for Nicole Kidman's Santine. Avril certainly gave Toulouse-Lautrec a lot of inspiration. I mean, just look at her. She's amazing, a can-can dancer extraordinaire. She was extremely thin and given to, quote, jerky movements and sudden contortions. She was nicknamed La Mélinite after a popular explosive made of picric acid, as well as L'Estrange, the strange one, and Jeanne la Folle, Jane the Crazy. Like Piaf, she was born in Belleville, and like Bernhardt, her mother was a prostitute or courtesan, and her father was an aristocrat. After being raised by her grandparents, her mother took custody of her when she was a teenager with the intention of having her enter the sex trade. She ran away, and she was admitted to the infamous Salpêtrière Hospital in 1882. She was diagnosed with a movement disorder known as St. Vitus's dance. She basically had nervous tics, thrashing of limbs, and rhythmic swaying. She was treated for, quote, female hysteria, but she later claimed in her biography that when she discovered dance, she was cured. The story is likely apocryphal, but it's so good. Maybe it was marketing, but she kept some of these mannerisms as a part of her signature style. The Belgian author Franz Jourdain described her as, quote, this exquisite creature, nervous and neurotic, the captivating flower of artistic corruption and of sickly grace. I've been called worse. It's kind of like the manic pixie dream girl of the Montmartre set. When Louise Weber, known by her stage name Logoliou, left the Moulin Rouge in 1895, Avril replaced her and became the most famous dancer in a city of famous dancers. She eventually retired in 1905 and married the French artist Maurice Billet. Tragically, she was bankrupted by the Great Depression and died in 1943 at age 74 in poverty and obscurity. Not a fitting end for this legendary woman. This monument, the Mur des Féderés, marks the site of a massacre of 147 men. See, Père Lachaise isn't just a place of tranquility and peace. It has twice been the site of armed fighting. Once in 1814 during the Napoleonic Wars, when it was overrun by Russians in the Battle of Paris, and a second time in May 1871. This was during the turmoil of the Paris Commune, when a French revolutionary government seized power for a few months in the spring of 1871. The French army slaughtered the Commune soldiers and buried them in a mass grave on this site, and you can still see the bullet holes. Here we are at the shared grave of Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas. Stein was an avant-garde writer, poet, storyteller, patron of the arts, an early feminist figure, and an open lesbian at a time when that could destroy your career, credibility, and reputation. She moved to Paris from California in 1903, and at the age of 29, she began hosting a well-known salon here on the left bank. That is, an evening of arts and ideas that was attended by figures such as Pablo Picasso, Ernest Hemingway, Henri Matisse, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and many others. Always with her was the love of her life and fellow Californian Alice B. Toklas. They met here in Paris in 1907 and moved in together a few years later, with Toklas acting as Stein's secretary as much as her wife. Stein would later have her first commercial success with the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, an account of their lives told from Alice's point of view, in a more linear fashion than most of her writing. Throughout her life, Stein had a strange sense of politics, and despite her bohemian lifestyle, queer identity, and leftist friends, Stein always hewed to the political right, even signing up to be a propagandist for the authoritarian, Nazi-dominated political regime, though some wonder if that was a self-preservation strategy. The couple avoided detection by lying low in southern France throughout the war, and sold off pieces from their now priceless art collection of paintings by Picasso and Matisse. Stein died at age 72 from stomach cancer, complicated, iconic, and salty as hell. Alice would go on to live for another 2 decades, and they are reunited here. You can see Alice's name on the back of the slab and these stones placed on the top, an act of memory common in Jewish culture, but now becoming more generally accepted amongst everybody. Now that we've seen a few graves, let's talk about the history of the cemetery. So who was Père Lachaise? He was confessor to Louis XIV, Father, or Père, François de Lachaise, and he lived in a house on this site. In 1804, Paris bought the property because they were having a bit of a problem. It's one that I detail in my video on the catacombs, and I regularly talk about when visiting London's churchyards and cemeteries, and that problem was overcrowding and stink. By this point in history, Paris had become a major metropolis with more than 500,000 residents and all manner of grand monuments, buildings, boulevards, and most importantly, church burial grounds. The people who lived in the City of Light were oblivious to the danger brewing beneath their feet. See, of course, the city was smelly and putrid, but there was an even more alarming danger than the diseased ooze escaping the coffins. Paris's ancient quarries had essentially led to Swiss cheese beneath its streets. In 1774, a series of basement walls collapsed around the Holy Innocents Cemetery, which had first been established in 1130. The massive weight of more than 2 million Parisians buried in the cemetery's mass graves finally hit a breaking point, and there was a widespread fear that more collapses could devastate the city. Of course, cholera outbreaks caused by the contamination from the mass graves were also a huge problem, and Louis XVI, the then King of France, knew he needed to take action. He established the Paris catacombs, a place to empty out all of those cumbersome, heavy old churchyards and ancient cemeteries, and a place to store the bones beneath the streets. But now that the old bones were dealt with, we still needed a place to inter the new dead. And that's where Napoleon comes into play. He bought the property around Père Lachaise's house and hired neoclassical architect Alexandre Théodore Brongniart to design it. Just a fun fact, he's the painter of this little Miss Brongniart, painted by Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun and hanging at the National Gallery in London. I love her. Brongniart was inspired by English-style gardens, deliberately designed with uneven paths and lined with a mix of various types of trees and plants. And that's quite funny because Père Lachaise itself would go on to inspire the British with the magnificent 7 cemeteries in London. However, initially the cemetery remained nearly empty. Parisians considered it too far from the city, and many Roman Catholics refused to be buried here as the land had not been properly blessed by the church. That said, today there are over 1 million bodies buried here, and it's a great honor to be interred at this cemetery, but in its opening year, the cemetery was only home to 13 graves. But the administrators had an idea to drum up interest. They organized the transfer of the remains of 2 of France's greatest 17th century literary figures, Jeanne de La Fontaine and Moliére, who died in 1673, and brought them from the catacombs to Père Lachaise. See, they had originally been buried in Les Innocents Cemetery, and so it was kind of feasible, I guess, that their bones had been tracked down and identified. But it's much more likely that these graves are filled with some random bones, let's be honest. Let's just pause and have a look at Moliére, whose real name was Jean-Baptiste Poquelin. He was a celebrated playwright, actor, and poet, regarded by many as the greatest French writer to ever live. His dramatic death became the stuff of legend. During a performance of his own work, The Imaginary Invalid, Moliére was portraying a character faking his own death. While on stage, Moliére collapsed in a coughing fit and began to hemorrhage. The audience was delighted at his masterful performance, and Moliére insisted on completing the show. However, he collapsed after the final curtain and died that evening, without absolution. Now, this was particularly bad luck, as actors in the 17th century were often considered sinners simply just for their choice of profession, and they were required to renounce their profession and be delivered of the last rites by a priest before death to be considered for burial in consecrated grounds. Molière's widow begged the king to allow her husband to be buried, which he was, secretly and at night. But legend says he was permitted only to be buried in part of the Les Innocents cemetery reserved for unbaptized infants, which was a compromise, so that's disputed. Lucky for Molière, Père Lachaise, the new cemetery, needed his celebrity to drum up business, and now he has this splendid tomb raised up on 4 plinths, surrounded by an iron fence. Not too shabby for a man once denied a proper burial. Next to him, we can see another literary figure transported here a century after his death. Jean de La Fontaine, a noted French fabulist and translator of Aesop's famous stories. He was one of the most widely read poets of the 17th century. He, too, was given a much more spectacular grave than his previous interment, when he'd just been jumbled in a pile of bones in the catacombs. Now, after these chaps were reburied here, interest in the cemetery slowly grew, and the administrators repeatedly used this tactic, moving the purported remains of Pierre Abelard, the 12th century French philosopher and poet, and his student and wife, the brilliant Heloise Argenteuil. Their story is sometimes presented as that of legend, but it's well documented as truth. Heloise and Abelard carried on a passionate and tragic love affair, not to mention an intense philosophical exchange. To protect her from her abusive uncle, who did not approve of their union, Abelard sent Heloise to a convent in Brittany, but he was soon attacked and castrated by men sent by her uncle. Heloise and Abelard soon retired to monasteries, but considered each other husband and wife until their death. Abelard died in 1143, and his remains were eventually given over to the loving care of Heloise, who eventually came to rest beside him in 1163. Tragic. Their bones and effigies have managed to survive the French Revolution, have been shuttled around more than a few times, and were brought here in 1817, although some dispute the authenticity of one or both of the skeletons. Shortly after their interment here, people began clamoring to be buried in Père Lachaise, and by 1830 the cemetery contained more than 33,000 graves. Oscar Wilde, was the noted Irish poet and playwright, author of works such as The Picture of Dorian Gray and The Importance of Being Earnest. But he was so much more than a fantastic writer. He was a savage wit, a bon vivant, and a leader in the aesthetic movement that championed beauty above function. He first found international fame and then infamy. See, he was the defendant in one of the world's first celebrity trials in 1895, after he was accused of gross indecency with men by the Marquess of Queensberry, the father of his lover, Lord Alfred Douglas. Douglas was an extravagant dandy himself. Now, Wilde actually first sued the Marquess for libel after the Marquess called him a sodomite, but it became clear that no libel had taken place because the insult was true. Brother. But that suit did give the Crown some ideas. They took the contents of that trial as proof of Wilde's homosexual acts, which were illegal in this country, shamefully, until 1960. Wilde assumed that his high social standing and his silver tongue would get him off the hook, but the judge was keen to make an example out of him during 2 subsequent trials. He was found guilty of gross indecency and sentenced to the maximum penalty of 2 years' hard labor, from which he never physically or emotionally recovered. He moved to Paris and died penniless just 3 years later at the age of 46, in November 1900. Cause of death was cited as meningitis, although that is often debated. He was originally buried in a cemetery outside the city, but he was reinterred here at Père Lachaise in 1909. His tomb is quite divisive. It was commissioned by his lover, Robert Ross, who at his own request had his ashes interred in the tomb on the 50th anniversary of his dear friend's death. The tomb draws its influence from the Assyrian Lamassu at the British Museum, from Wilde's poem, The Sphinx, and was designed by Jacob Epstein. It was previously anatomically correct, but the current whereabouts of the original genitalia are unknown, although rumor had it for some time that the testicles were being used as paperweights in the administration office of the cemetery. We can see that Wilde's grave is covered in a glass barrier. This was erected in 2011 in an attempt to stop the tradition of people kissing the tomb. Here I am in 2010 doing just that. See, for decades it had become popular for guests to freshen their lipstick and kiss the tomb. However, the animal fat in most lipsticks sinks into the stone and can cause permanent damage, and the cleaning of the stone simply served to make it more porous. Ireland's Office of Public Works considers the tomb an Irish overseas monument. I mean, where were they when he was alive? But they grew tired of paying for the constant cleaning, so they erected this glass. We can blow old Oscar a kiss, though. Just like many other 19th century cemeteries here in Paris and beyond, there isn't much room left. The plots that are available are extremely costly, so these days, the majority of people being interred here wind up in this memorial garden. Their ashes are first cremated at the crematorium, built here in the late 19th century in the wake, pun intended, of changing attitudes to cremation and a wider acceptance of the practice. In 789, Charlemagne banned what he saw as the pagan act of cremation in order to unite his kingdom around Christianity. Cremation was only finally legalized again more than 1,000 years later in 1887 under the principle of freedom of funerals, but the Catholic Church banned the practice until 1963. The tall column that looks somewhat like a monument of some kind is actually the old chimney to a single cremator. The cremations today, however, take place in the main crematorium, and the chimneys there are mostly concealed by a dome. The dome was originally built to discreetly cover the true work of the building, owing to the sensibilities of the nearby residents, as remember, the Catholic Church forbade cremations until the mid-60s. Today, cremation accounts for around 40% of the dead in France, much, much lower than the UK at nearly 80%. That said, the crematorium is very busy indeed, carrying out dozens of cremations every day. After the job is complete, your loved one can either take your ashes home with them, or you can be spread here in the memorial garden. Just as a gravestone provides a focal point and physical place to grieve and commune with the dead, the memorial garden is also a place to lay flowers or trinkets and commemorate with those who are gone.
There is another place where people can come to visit with their departed loved ones who have been cremated, and that's here at the Columbarium. A columbarium is a building solely dedicated to the storage of cremains. There are the ashes of some well-known figures resting here, including Paul Landowski. He was the Polish-French sculptor who designed Christ the Redeemer in Rio de Janeiro, and Isadora Duncan, the American-born pioneer of modern contemporary dance, who was tragically killed in 1927 when the scarf she was wearing tangled in the spokes of a convertible in the south of France. The most famous person to reside here in the Columbarium was Maria Callas, the legendary Greek-American opera singer known almost as much for her scandalous personal life as she was for her incredible vocal range. Leonard Bernstein once called her the Bible of opera. After a tumultuous career, she spent her last few years living mostly in isolation here in Paris and died of a heart attack at age 53 in September 1977. Her ashes were placed in an urn here in the Columbarium, but just a few months later, the urn was stolen. It was thankfully found nearby a few hours later, and a couple of years after that, her ashes were scattered over the Aegean, fulfilling one of her final wishes. Here's the resting place inside the Columbarium of Richard Wright. He was an African-American writer and existentialist philosopher who wrote popular novels such as Native Son and his own autobiography, Black Boy. He married a white woman, Ellen Poplar, at a time before it was legal in America, leading to constant humiliation and racist abuse. By 1947, they grew so frustrated with the daily racism they faced that they moved to Paris, where black celebrities found relative freedom and acceptance. He never returned to the United States other than a few brief visits, and he died in 1960 of a heart attack at the young age of 52. You can see here people have left a coin, a pen, some rocks, and he's also got a little snail visitor too. This whole section here belongs to different French communists. The French Communist Party purchased a plot here, right, with very good real estate. A few of the graves I'm looking for today, like the next one, are not on any map, so I'm just here literally walking through the graves looking for it for you. True sacrifice for my viewers. Well, according to the map, Sarah Bernhardt's grave should be just right around here. It's not on the official Père Lachaise map, which I find really unusual, considering that Sarah Bernhardt was one of the most famous people of her era. I think I finally spotted it right here. There we go. Sarah Bernhardt. Difficult to find, I'll tell you that. Here are a few of her photos, but you might recognize her better as the iconic model for some of Art Nouveau artist Alphonse Mucha's most famous works. She was his biggest champion and his favorite muse. She also inspired poet Jean Cocteau and the playwright Edmond Rostand, to name a few. Cocteau nicknamed her the Sacred Monster. She was born in the Latin Quarter of Paris in 1844, the illegitimate daughter of a Jewish courtesan and an upper-class lawyer. Similar to Jane Avril, with the help of one of her mother's aristocratic patrons, she began studying acting in her teens and went on to become the biggest celebrity in the world, owing to the fact that she formed her own traveling company and became an international idol, playing Cleopatra, Cordelia, and a cross-dressing Hamlet. Think of her as the Lady Gaga of her day. She liked to wear a stuffed bat on her hat, slept in a coffin that she took on tour, and once traveled around America accompanied by an alligator that she named Ali Gaga, who died after drinking too much milk and champagne. I love her. In addition to being a talented actress with a so-called golden voice, she was also a gifted sculptor, creating this bust of her husband, fellow actor Jacques Damallat, shortly after he died of a drug overdose. He was Bram Stoker's inspiration for his characterization of Dracula, so that should give you an idea of his kind of demeanor and countenance in person. Bernhardt had scandalous affairs and partied hard, but she got away with it all because of her raw talent. She died at the age of 78 in 1923, performing on a wooden leg after her leg was amputated in her golden years. dazzling audiences until nearly the very end. France was occupied during the Second World War, and the country was split into two zones. It's estimated that around 75,000 French Jews were transported from the northern German-occupied zone to concentration camps across Europe. This section of the cemetery that we're now walking through is home to a number of memorials commemorating them and all victims of concentration and extermination camps. Here you will find monuments erected to those who suffered in places like Auschwitz, Mauthausen, Buchenwald, Neuengamme, Ravensbrück, and Oranienburg. This is an extremely sobering and moving place to contemplate our past. For a moment here, we're just going to pop outside of the cemetery walls and have a look at another remembrance of war. Now here is something incredibly moving and sobering. I walked past this with my mum yesterday. The dead of the Great War, Paris and her children. These are all men, and I'm sure a few women, who died each year in World War I, listed alphabetically per year. The names just endless. Let's stop and read a few. This is from 1914. Jean-Georges Brun, Joseph Anatole Brun, Léon Brun, Marius Charles Brunet, Georges Gaston Broyant. The names go on and on. Now this wall is just on the exterior of the main cemetery entrance where we're heading right now. Real estate in Père Lachaise is in high demand. Not just anyone can be admitted here. The cemetery does prefer to allow people of high status, celebrities, and other notable folks to be interred here. One way to get around the problem of space is by leasing the land for shorter time periods. You heard me correctly. You can buy a grave plot here for 10 years, 25 years, 50 years, or in perpetuity, which means for eternity, forever. So if you do buy a grave for 10 years, what happens when that time is up? Well, you're going to have to move the body to another cemetery, or maybe you'll choose to cremate at that point. Short-lived glory. Here you have an example of what can happen to a grave that is held here in perpetuity. Over the generations, the responsibility for caretaking the old graves slowly dies with each generation, and you end up with graves that are here forever with no one looking out for them. When you come to visit Père Lachaise, you can often find your way around by using a map, QR code, and these signs to tell you which division you're in. Right now, I'm in 66. Another grave, likely here in perpetuity, damaged almost beyond recognition. And yet here beside it, the Lavasse family, freshly cleaned, bright and new, looking fantastic. Here we have the sepulchre of the Famille Caillebotte, the eternal resting place of Gustave Caillebotte. I'm actually quite excited because I went to see the Caillebotte exhibition at the Musée d'Orsay, so I'm here to pay my respects. Though Caillebotte is often lumped in with the Impressionists, he was actually quite different. One way was his bourgeois upbringing on Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis in Paris. He was educated originally as a lawyer and went on to inherit a sizable fortune while studying painting at the École des Beaux-Arts in 1873. He was friends with Degas and Ruart and did exhibit with the Impressionists at their second exhibition in 1878, but he ultimately helped them more as a financial benefactor and collector, buying their works and helping them stay afloat. But while Degas is famous for his paintings of girls and women, Caillebotte is notable for his paintings of men at work and leisure. Here's one of his most famous, The Floor Scrapers, which was actually very controversial for its realist subject matter. After all, one should paint aspirational things, not brute labor. Of course, his appreciation for the male form and the fact he never married has led people to speculate that he was gay, and his exhibition at the Musée d'Orsay is called aptly Painting Men. He died of pulmonary congestion at the age of 45, and his painting career has long been overshadowed by his role as a collector, although this exhibition, which is being hailed as a once-in-a-generation affair, may just change that. You can see what I mean here. This is the back of Caillebotte's sepulchre, and you can see concession à perpetuity, so here permanently. And another one with the door spookily wide open. Listen, I don't believe in ghosts, but I'm not going over there. Wow, another spectacular one just across the pathway. Let's just peek inside here. Wow. You can see it's almost like its own chapel, and you can hear the echoing of my voice. Now, I'm not going to step directly inside. I don't think that's very respectful, but we can see here, and ominously the latch on the floor to open up the crypt below. There are dogs all over this cemetery. I always say the English and the French have more in common than they think. They both love dogs. Dogs, of course, representing fidelity, unconditional love, and in some cases, just the departed's best friend. My friends, I don't actually know anything about this family, but here's another one with their dogs. Fantastic. This is just a good example. I could do all the research possible before getting here, but you just see things that gobsmack you when you actually get here. Ooh, if you have a look here on this sepulchre, you can see these inverted torches. In cemeteries of the 19th century, it was very popular to see symbols flipped upside down to represent that they were in the world of the dead. Marcel Proust was a French novelist and critic, considered one of the most influential writers of the 20th century, particularly on the topic of memory. He was born to an eminent physician father and a Jewish mother in 1871 and struggled with his homosexuality and poor health throughout his life. Sadly, he died at age 51 of pneumonia. When you visit, you might see Proust's grave covered in madeleines, a small sponge cake. In French, a Madeleine de Proust is an expression used to describe smells, tastes, and sounds reminding you of your childhood or bringing back emotionally charged memories from a long time ago. The saying comes from the first in Proust's 7-volume novel, In Search of Lost Time, which was published in 1913. In this book, Proust writes about his mother offering him tea and a madeleine to warm him up, and how this same combination later in life caused him to become overwhelmed by emotion and to recover a lost narrative of events that had occurred in his early life. It was considered unreadable at the time, but is today recognized as one of the major literary works of French expression. And you can see here, I'm just going to leave this little madeleine on the grave. Thank you. Funny enough, this is the only grave that I visited that is surrounded by crows, probably because they know people leave madeleines on this grave in particular. Oh, look at this one here with this kind of twisted metal and broken glass. Let's just have a little peek inside.
Here we have the final resting place of Hébuterne au Clair, an important figure in French feminism who fought for the right of women to vote, as well as for labor rights for all working class people. My favorite detail about her is that she would sneak into wedding ceremonies and then heckle when the priest stated that a woman owed submission and obedience to her husband. Hébuterne continued her activism throughout her life, writing articles, speeches, and illegally standing for elections until she died at the age of 66 in 1914. Sadly, she didn't live to see her dream realized. Women in France weren't given the right to vote until 1944, but she was given this unique resting place amongst some of France's greatest names. Sadly, Hébuterne tomb is easy to overlook, as she is laid to rest directly opposite the far more well-known Honoré de Balzac. Here we can see that his grave features a bronze sculpture by Pierre Jean David Anger, as well as a quill and a copy of his greatest work, The Human Comedy. Balzac was a French novelist and playwright, born in 1799. He added the de to his name in a fit of pretension, as it indicated that he was of aristocratic origin. He moved to Paris at the age of 20, began writing, and the rest is history. During his extensive travels, he met a Polish countess, Eve de Balzac, who is buried here alongside her husband. He died of a heart attack at the young age of 51, likely due to his intense travel schedule and grueling writing regimen. His 1850 funeral was attended by, quote, almost every writer in Paris. Victor Hugo himself was a pallbearer and delivered the eulogy. Thanks for waiting. Here we have the tomb of Eugène Delacroix, one of my favorites of the French Romantic painters, and someone who really bridged the gap between the stuffy work of the academic painters and the Impressionists. I particularly love the Study for a Lion Hunt held at the Musée d'Orsay, but undoubtedly his most famous work is Liberty Leading the People, a depiction of the July Revolution that removed King Charles X from the throne. That painting was good for Delacroix's soul and his artistic integrity. To keep up with his lavish lifestyle, he had previously been working for King Charles X, and he hated working for a man he had considered an enemy, although not enough to not take his money. He felt much better about this revolutionary subject matter, which was much more in line with his values. He wrote, "I have undertaken a modern subject, a barricade, and although I may not have fought for my country, at least I shall have painted for her. It has restored my good spirits." A little bit later on, I'm going to tell you about a legendary feud he had with the academic painter Ingres, but Delacroix died in 1863 from an unknown illness, and in his will, he forbade any representation of his features in the future, so no posthumous portraits, and so his tomb bears no depiction of the man himself. It is a sturdy grey granite box of neoclassical design and not romantic at all. Ingres might have approved. He once told Georges Sand, "There are horrid things in this world, but after all, what shall we find beyond it? Night, dreadful night." Let's hope he's somewhere a little nicer. You can see here the chapels that are used for services. One is Catholic and one non-denominational. Also behind us, we have a magnificent view down into Paris. Well, that does depend on if you think Montparnasse is a magnificent view or not. The middle finger in the center of Paris. This is such a jaw-dropping monument, a statue of Romantic painter Théodore Géricault himself, holding a palette and reclining in the manner of an Etruscan funerary effigy, designed by sculptor Antoine Itex. The front bears a relief of his legendary painting, The Raft of the Medusa, which hangs in the Louvre and stunned audiences with its realistic depiction of the grisly aftermath of the wreck of the French naval frigate the Medusa. Géricault, an avid horseman and dandy, was particularly drawn to macabre subjects. He was also an abolitionist. The painting's human pyramid represents France's empire, built on the backs of enslaved African people. He may have had a short career, as he died at the young age of 32, but his departure from the neoclassical style and bold choice of unusual subjects, like this series of portraits of the insane, called Insane Women, had a huge impact on the history of modern art, and I honestly think this is one of the coolest graves on our tour. I always find it a little bit creepy when the doors are open like that.
Oh, and then here you can see that this family has also purchased their plot in perpetuity, but the writing is on the front of the sepulchre, not on the back, just because it faces onto a wall.
Wow, okay, this one stopped me right in its tracks. Again, I hadn't planned on speaking about this, but this is called La Mémoire Nécropolitaine. It's a chapel occupied by a giant camera, but it is currently empty. It will be the future resting place of photographer André Chabot, whose profession is photographing funeral art. Chabot has numerous books with titles like Mustaches of Stone, and you can buy them online on his website. People have come here and placed all these ties of camera film here, which is fascinating. And the grave even comes with its own QR code, so you can learn about it by smartphone. Wow, let's have a look at this imposing monument. This is the tomb of Casimir Pierre Perrier, a prominent French banker and statesman. He was actually the French Prime Minister from March 1831 until his untimely death from the cholera in 1832. After that epidemic died down, sculptor Jean-Pierre Carteau designed and built this tomb mausoleum for him. Perrier is here at the top of the structure, and below there are 3 bas-reliefs representing eloquence, justice, and strength. And just look at this. Thousands upon thousands of remarkable graves like this one here, just belonging to regular people who aren't written about in the history books. The entire cemetery is just so, so beautiful. Most walking tours of Père Lachaise finish with Jim Morrison, saving him as the pièce de résistance, but I've put him here towards the beginning. He certainly is famous enough to be at the end, though. I must admit, on my first visit to this cemetery at the age of 18, he was my top priority. I don't even think I knew who Edith Piaf was then. He was, of course, the lead singer of the rock band The Doors, named for Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception, a book that was written on mescaline, and old Jim himself was no stranger to hallucinogens. After skyrocketing to fame with the release of The Doors' single Light My Fire in 1967, Morrison was still at the height of his fame when he died, unexpectedly of an accidental drug overdose in a Parisian bathtub at the age of 27. His death landed him a top spot as a member of the mythical but legendary 27 Club. After a hurried medical examination, leading to many conspiracies that maybe he faked his own death, Morrison was buried here in Père Lachaise. In the beginning, his grave had no official marker, so fans made one of their own. Exasperated French officials placed a marker on the grave in 1973, which was promptly stolen. In 1981, a Croatian sculptor, Mladen Mikulin, received permission from the cemetery to place a marble bust and a new gravestone on top of Morrison's resting place to commemorate the 10th anniversary of his death. However, the bust was, you guessed it, defaced and stolen in 1988. Finally, in 1990, Morrison's father had a flat stone placed on the grave. It bears a Greek inscription that reads, "True to his own spirit." However, the grave was already a place of pilgrimage, with fans paying their respects in increasingly disruptive and peculiar ways. I remember coming here in the 90s, and the place was covered with lit cigarettes, burning candles, bottles of wine, underwear, condoms, and drug paraphernalia, all of which I think Jim probably would have loved, mind you. Someone even tried to steal his body. As a result, the plot is now mostly blocked off from the public, but you can see that people so desperate to mark their visit covered the trees in gum and other detritus. Obviously, this peeves some people, and it causes an inconvenience to the administrators at Père Lachaise. But it's worth noting that when Jim Morrison was first buried here, his plot was only leased for a 50-year period by his girlfriend Pam. Remember those different levels of purchase that I told you about. So even though his lease has expired, Jim is still here. See, the cemetery doesn't want to let him go. This really relates back to the original owners gaining prestige and attention from the celebrity burials like Moliére and La Fontaine. Jim Morrison is just the 20th century's version of those famous men. This one here is absolutely devastating. It belongs to a victim of the November 2015 Paris terrorist attacks, in which the Bataclan nightclub and other venues in Paris were attacked. This is Susan Garrigues, and she was just 21 years old when she was killed. She was a language student at the Sorbonne, beloved by her fellow students, family, and friends, and she had a love of reading Zola. This is just a tragic reminder of the horror of violence, no matter where it takes place in the world.
Here's the family sepulchre of the Le Riche family, and you can see here a really common motif on different tombs in Père Lachaise, these weeping mourners. I kept seeing these as I walked around the cemetery. Here's another one here. I really love this, that over time, as the moisture and the rain builds up, it looks like these figures are actually weeping. This grave nearly stopped me in my tracks. It's of the Guatemalan writer Miguel Ángel Asturias. Rising above his bronze funerary plaque is a Mayan stele, similar to the ones found in the Mayan ruins in his native country. To this day, Asturias is Central America's only Nobel Prize for Literature winner, which was awarded to him in 1967. A beautiful bit of Central America here in the Parisian cemetery. If you've been to the Louvre and then gotten lost in the Louvre, happens to me still, despite my 3 videos on the museum, then you already know this name for the massive Denon wing. This is Dominique Vivant Denon, sculpted by Pierre Cartellier for his grave in 1826. Denon was an explorer, Egyptologist, diplomat, author, engraver, and yes, erotic novelist. A few of those on our tour. Towards the end of the 18th century, he was one of the world's premier Egyptophiles. He really looks like he has such a kind face, right? Well, not so fast. He's also one of history's most prolific looters. During the Egyptian campaign of 1798 to 1801, he was embedded with the important General d'Essai and took sketches of the grand monuments, tombs, and ancient art, sometimes even when under attack by the enemy. He was present for the excavation and subsequent looting of thousands of priceless artifacts and became something of an expert in the region, which is why Napoleon appointed him as the first director of the Louvre. In 1802, he published his pivotal Journey in Lower and Upper Egypt, often considered the foundation of modern Egyptology. Later, he headed the Musée Napoleon and personally looted vast numbers of works of art from Italy, the Low Countries, and Germany, as well as from Spain with none other than Goya's help. Today, many of these are still in the Louvre or elsewhere in the country. No matter what you think of his personal life and his behavior, Denon's works spawned a worldwide fascination with Egyptian themes and architecture. Now we're here at the grave of Polish-born Frédéric Chopin, one of the most beloved composers of all time. A virtuoso pianist and prodigy, by the age of 15, Chopin was already performing for such people as the Tsar Alexander I. He was known as the greatest pianist and composer of the Romantic age. Responsible for developing new techniques for playing the piano, Chopin's personal life was also quite dishy, with a number of highly publicized love affairs with both men and women. Plagued by ill health throughout his life, he died at the age of just 39, likely from tuberculosis. But while Chopin's body is buried here at Père Lachaise, his heart lies elsewhere. In a reversal of Jacques-Louis David, who we will see next, he requested that his heart be smuggled back to his homeland. However, it isn't completely as romantic as it seems. Chopin actually had a morbid fear of being buried alive, and he knew that the act of removing his heart would ensure that that didn't happen. His heart was soaked in cognac, encased in an oak box, and installed in a Warsaw church. Let me know in the comments below if you've been there. Back here in Paris, his funeral was held at the Church of the Madeleine and was attended by over 3,000 people, including Delacroix, who we've just met, who was one of the pallbearers. His tomb features a statue of Euterpe, the muse of music, mourning over a broken lyre. Let's listen to a little bit of Chopin while we appreciate where he rests. Well, where most of him rests. Now this is the grave of Charlotte David, born Marguerite Pécule, and it's also kind of the final resting place of Jacques-Louis David. I'll explain what I mean by kind of a bit later on.
Here is a lovely portrait that he painted of his wife, who was half his age, like many here, but I digress. David was the leading painter in France of the neoclassical movement, also called academic art, because it was the preferred style of the Parisian salon. As David painted the subjects the salon approved of most, historical epics, mythology, and great portraits, he always did very well, first winning acclaim with the Oath of the Horatii, which hangs in the Louvre. He was born in Paris in 1748 and trained under classical artist Marie-Joseph Vienne before taking an active role in the Revolution of 1789 and helping to abolish the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, even though, as I mentioned, he always did very well there. He was close friends with Robespierre and has been described as, quote, a dictator of the arts in the First French Republic. He was eventually imprisoned after Robespierre's fall and aligned himself with Napoleon, of course. He painted this famous portrait of Napoleon, as well as the coronation of Napoleon, which features in 2 of my Louvre videos. After Napoleon's final defeat in 1815 and the return of the Bourbons, he chose self-exile and lived in Brussels, where he died after being by a horse coach. Here's his death mask. While his body is buried in Brussels, his heart was brought back here to the city he loved, Paris, and it's buried here with his wife Charlotte. So maybe this bonus heart makes up for the missing heart of Chopin. Here we have the grave of Sidonie Gabrielle Colette, simply known better as Colette, a French author famous for her 1944 novella, Gigi, that was adapted into a film and a stage production. She was also an actress, journalist, and yes, even a mime. Marcel Marceau is not the only mime here in the cemetery. Her husband, Henry Gauthier Villard, who went by the name Willie, wrote a series of popular novels, the Claudine stories, loosely based on Colette's life and appearance. He also encouraged her to partake in lesbian relationships and write her own titillating stories. When they split up, she had no recourse to this money. She gobbled together a career of portraying Claudine on the stage, sometimes acting out her own stories. To make ends meet, she worked as a journalist and a photographer and lived openly with women, including Mathilde de Mornay, the Marquise de Belleboeuf, known as Max. They also acted together, and when Max and Colette shared an onstage kiss in 1907, it nearly caused a riot. The two were no longer able to live together, but their relationship lasted another 5 years. She eventually married another man and had a daughter, also called Colette, although she cheated on him with her 16-year-old stepson. And finally she married Maurice Gudec, 16 years her junior. The two remained together until her death. Though he was Jewish, she wrote for several pro-Nazi publications, although some believe that this was an attempt to keep them from arresting Maurice. In 1944, she wrote Gigi, about a girl born into a family of demi-mondaines, that is, women on the fringes of high society who clung on to financial stability through their dalliances with powerful men. That sounds a lot like Sarah Bernhardt's and Jane Avril's mothers, who are also in this cemetery. Colette became a famous public figure after the war, and although she was refused a religious funeral by the Catholic Church due to her divorces, she was the first French woman of letters to be given a state funeral. Oh, here we have a few more of those weeping mourners. And this tomb belongs to the Danton family. The patriarch, Antoine-Joseph Laurent Danton, was a sculptor born in 1762 and lived for 80 years, married to his wife, Marie Charlotte, and with 2 sons, Jean-Pierre and Antoine Laurent, both of them sculptors as well as caricaturists, and their tomb really is fitting of a family of sculptors. Here we have the family tomb of Georges-Eugéne Haussmann, who was the genius mind behind the redevelopment of Paris under French Emperor Napoleon III. Between 1853 and 1870, Haussmann oversaw the demolition of medieval neighborhoods that were deemed overcrowded and unhealthy by officials at that time, in order to build new wide avenues, parks, squares, fountains, and sewers, as well as give Paris its kind of uniform look no matter where you go in the city. It is actually kind of tragic. I would love to see what the medieval streets and footprint looked like, and it's completely gone. He really is the architect of Paris, with his vast public works program visible everywhere we look today.
Beautiful Art Nouveau tomb. This kind of modernist sculpture here for Lucien Gibert, who was a sculptor himself. It's very hard when making a video of cemeteries like this. I have an itinerary planned, but I keep getting sidetracked by all of the interesting, unusual graves. We're just now approaching the grave of Georges Méliès, one of the pioneers of cinema. My undergrad film history professor would not forgive me if I didn't come to pay my respects. Look at this fantastic bust, and people have left here, a poker chip, Polaroid photo, and flowers. Méliès actually started his career as a magician. It makes sense when you think about the early days of film being little more than magic tricks caught on camera. He led so many technical and narrative developments in the early days of cinema, influencing us to this day, in particular with his trick films and his innovative use of special effects. Of course, his most famous, the iconic A Trip to the Moon. Just look at this impressive sepulchre for Alfred Chauchard. He was an art collector. Wow, look at those mutton chops. Holy! Fantastic bust. As an art collector, I think he'd approve.
To me, this is one of the most fascinating graves in the entire cemetery, that of Joseph Crocé-Spinelli and Théodore Sivel. We can see that the two men are draped in a funerary shroud with their fingers clasped together. The inscription reads that they perished in a balloon called the Zenith on April 15, 1875, at around 28,000 feet in the air. The men were balloonists at a time when ballooning was ballooning in popularity, literally, and higher altitudes were being sought to better understand the science of the atmosphere and weather. Of course, at a certain height, the oxygen thins, and it becomes impossible to maintain consciousness. So, Crocé-Spinelli, Sivel, and a third balloonist called Gaston Tissandier ascended into the air with these bags of air, determined to break the existing record of 36,000 feet. However, once the balloon reached the, quote, death zone at around 26,000 feet, they began to go in and out of consciousness, and they could no longer properly or consciously reach for the oxygen tubes located above their heads. But that didn't stop them. With their last bit of energy, they were gripped by excitement at rising higher and higher and achieving the record. After a good gulp of air, and quite possibly very delirious, Crocé-Spinelli decided to throw out all the equipment, and then the balloon rose to 28,000 feet, which was captured by a recording of their barometer. However, when Tissandier came to, he found that his companions were both dead, and the balloon was rapidly plummeting, eventually crashing down to earth. He survived, but Sivel and Crocé-Spinelli had to be removed from the wreckage. They were hailed as martyrs to science who helped advance aviation, and this elaborate grave was sculpted by Alphonse Dumilâtre to honor their sacrifice.
It's often possible to tell the notable graves from a distance because you'll see flowers there. Here is the sepulchre or tomb of the Seurat family, and of course, the eternal resting place of Georges Seurat. In a cemetery filled with tragic figures, Seurat is probably one of the most tragic. He was a post-impressionist artist well on his way to international success after pioneering a new technique called pointillism. He painted some of the late 19th century's most iconic paintings, including the Bathers at Asnières and A Sunday Afternoon on La Grande Jatte, which was famously the inspiration for Sondheim's Sunday in the Park with George, and this Ferris Bueller scene. But Seurat's talent could not protect him from tragedy. See, he was in a clandestine relationship with Madeleine Knobloch, an artist model 10 years his junior. We find that a lot on this tour. He portrayed her in this painting, Jeune femme saupoudrant. The couple had one son, and she was pregnant with another baby when Seurat contracted an illness, variously reported as pneumonia, diphtheria, meningitis. We're not sure. He died in March 1891 at the age of 31, and just a few weeks later, his little boy died of the same illness. Madeleine then gave birth to a stillborn child. That must have been unbearably painful for her. I'll tell you, if I lived in Paris, I would make my entire living guiding in this cemetery. Delphine de Cambaceres. We've seen a lot of busts of men, but very few of women. Our next grave belongs to a man whose name may not ring a bell, but this is one of the most visited graves in all of Père Lachaise, that of Victor Noir. Noir was a journalist in the 19th century at a time of great social and political upheaval. The country was divided between the Republicans and the monarchists. Victor's editor, Pascal Grousset, a Republican, became involved in a dispute with Prince Pierre Bonaparte, cousin of the then Emperor Napoleon III. Of course, Bonaparte was a monarchist, and the two squabbled over articles written in competing newspapers. To resolve the dispute, a duel was proposed. Grousset chose Victor Noir as one of his seconds for the duel, and Noir then went to go and negotiate the terms of the fight. But Bonaparte was offended that Grousset hadn't come himself. Now here's where the stories differ. Noir's companion claimed that Noir, offended at being treated as a lackey, tried to argue with the prince, who then slapped Noir and shot him dead. However, Bonaparte claimed it was Noir who hit him first, and so he drew his revolver and fired. The court ultimately accepted the prince's version of the story, but of course I'm sure that being the cousin of the emperor didn't sway the verdict or anything. Victor's murder and Bonaparte's acquittal at a time when the emperor was already deeply unpopular caused public outrage and violent demonstrations. Before long, Victor became a symbol of the Republican fight, and more than 100,000 people joined his funeral procession. After originally being buried at Neuilly, Victor's body was moved to Père Lachaise after the overthrowing of the emperor's regime. Jules Dalou cast this elaborate bronze statue to mark his grave, depicting Noir having just fallen to the ground after being shot, dropping his hat beside him. But you might notice that the statue is a bit worn in other places. And why has this become one of the most popular grave sites in the cemetery? Well, as my grandmother would have put it, there's a notable protuberance in Victor's trousers, and over the years his impressive bulge has become the focus of attention. People believe that leaving a flower in Victor's hat, kissing the statue on the lips, or indeed rubbing his member will enhance fertility or even bring a husband within a year. See what I mean? In the past, a fence was erected to protect the statue from further amorous attention, but public outcry was so great that it was eventually torn down. Well, hello there. Absolutely not. Okay, bye. Here's the grave of Pierre Bourdieu and his wife, Marie Claire. He was a French sociologist and intellectual and contributed hundreds of journals and more than a dozen books on sociology, aesthetics, and education. His work is mostly concerned with power and the power present in pedagogy. You can see here people have left little mementos for him. Just died in 2002. Hi. Let's go pay our respects to Ingres. Here he is here. In some ways, Ingres represents the old guard of academic painting, the portraits of Napoleon, the type of art that the Impressionists, the cool kids later on, fought against. At a time when the more emotional Romanticism was taking flight, he clung to his neoclassical ideals that paintings should embody, quote, noble simplicity and calm grandeur. Jean-Auguste-Dominique Ingres was passionate about this divide. He had a fierce rivalry with another Père Lachaise resident who we've already met, Eugène Delacroix, whose paintings were a riot of colour and passion. They famously had a serious rivalry. Ingres once got so incensed about seeing Delacroix at a party that he began shouting about the honesty in painting and spilled an entire cup of coffee down his front. Delacroix responded to their competing solo exhibitions at the 1855 Exposition Universelle with this caricature of Ingres. And I hate to say it, but it really does look like him. But for all of his bluster against what he felt was the unhinged nature of romantic painting, then you see something like the Grande Odalisque with her impossibly long snake back. Ingres' distortions of reality actually really impressed and influenced both the Impressionists, the Cubists, and other modern artists who came later. In particular, Degas and Picasso were huge fans, citing his influence in their work. Ingres' portrait of Monsieur Bertin was a direct inspiration for Picasso's portrait of Gertrude Stein, who we've already met here in the cemetery. Ingres died of pneumonia at 86, and here he is here in his bust, sculpted by student Jean-Marie Bonacieux. Just on our way to visit with Corot, we find Honoré Daumier's grave here. Another artist that we saw at the Musée d'Orsay, the prolific caricaturist, painter, and sculptor, well known for his cartoons and drawings that satirized French political life in the 18th century. But just a few steps away, we find the grave of Corot. We're just so spoiled with the array of artists that we have here at Père Lachaise with their final resting place. Yet another, Camille Corot, who influenced another Camille Pissarro, who we'll see shortly. Now, Corot is known predominantly for his landscapes, but he faced a lot of pressure from his cloth merchant father to become a milliner. Finally, at age 26, he was given the freedom to paint, which was his passion. He didn't achieve success until a bit later in life, when he began painting in a softer style with a restricted color palette, and his influence on the Impressionists cannot be overstated. Especially here, you can see the way that the light reflects on the landscapes, and that really went on to inspire and influence the Barbizon school, and later, the Impressionists. He died of a stomach ailment in 1875 at the age of 78, and was interred here alone. He never married, and said that he was instead married to his art. Have you ever seen a mime and thought, oh, French? Well, that's probably because of Marcel Marceau, the legendary French clown, and yes, mime. He was born Marcel Mangel in 1923 in Strasbourg, but later changed his Jewish last name to Marceau to avoid being identified as a Jew in occupied France. At the urging of his cousin, he joined the French Jewish resistance. The first time Marcel used mime was after France was invaded in order to keep Jewish children quiet while he helped them escape to neutral Switzerland. That's a wild story, wow. After the war, he continued to champion the art form and became one of the world's most famous entertainers with Bip, his white-faced mime, based on the French Pierrot clowns, portraying him on stage and screen. Marceau was serious about the art of miming. He even founded the Compagnie de Mime Marcel Marceau and went on to create more than 100 pantomimes and even mime versions of Don Juan and Candide. I would love to pay my respects if only I could get out of this invisible box. Wow, this Grim Reaper just hanging off the edge of the crypt. Normally I don't agree when people say that cemeteries are spooky places, but I'm sorry, that one was pretty spooky. Here's one that I was very excited to see. The obelisk of the final resting place of Jean-François Champollion, often called Champollion the Younger to distinguish him from his father. He was a child prodigy and a master of languages, and where you may know his name is from my videos on the Louvre and the British Museum, because Champollion is responsible for deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphics and is often referred to as the founding father of Egyptology. He worked extensively on the Egyptian collection at the Musée du Louvre, but died tragically at the age of 41, right in the middle of publishing his book, Grammar of Ancient Egyptian. Thankfully, it was published posthumously under the supervision of his brother. Wow, this one coming up ahead. I've seen pictures of it, but it really doesn't do it justice. This is the grave of Fernand Arbelot. We have so many love stories in this cemetery, but this one has to take the cake. Okay, maybe it's actually David's heart, but this one is so visually striking that I just want to look at it from so many angles. This is Fernand Arbelot. We know very little about him other than he was serving as a director in the Westminster Bank when he died. Legend says that he never wanted to be parted from his wife and wished to gaze at her for all eternity. With her head in his hands, he certainly got his wish. Let's read the inscription. It says, "They were amazed at the beautiful journey that led them to the end of life." Here we have the final grave of our tour, and last but not least really applies here. This is the grave of Camille Pissarro, one of the most important Impressionist painters. His paintings can be seen in almost every museum of modern art around the world. As you may already know, and I've mentioned a few times, I have a series of videos on the Musée d'Orsay. Out of the core Impressionists, Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, Morrison, and Sicily, only Pissarro is here in Père Lachaise. He was born in St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands to Jewish parents, and he was sent to French boarding school at the age of 12. He was heavily influenced by another painter here in the cemetery, who we've already seen, Corot, as well as Millet and Courbet. But his life really changed when he met Monet and was invited to take part in the 1866 Salon des Refusés, essentially an exhibition of painters who were rejected by the establishment art world, populated by the likes of Ingres, Delacroix, and David, who we've already met today. Pissarro was the oldest in the group of Impressionists, and he was a mentor and wise father figure to these young upstarts. However, he sold almost nothing, and his family lived in poverty while he continued to buck the establishment and create groundbreaking works. He was the only painter to exhibit in all 8 Impressionist exhibitions, and he was particularly close to Cézanne. He introduced Gauguin, Signac, and Seurat, who we also met, into the group of painters. Sadly, he was plagued by eye problems, and he died blind in 1903 at the age of 73. Well, that's the end of our tour. I hope you've enjoyed spending time in this cemetery as much as I've enjoyed wandering around it on a few successive days. I'll see you the next time I'm at the museum or the cemetery.